Millions of despairing men, women, and little children, victims of a system that makes men torture and imprison innocent people.
You cannot shake hands with a clenched fist.
Produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of
the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
We're not saying that planet Earth is coming to an end. We're saying that planet Earth is about to be refurbished, spaded under, and have another chance to serve as a garden for another civilization.
Most of the people in here are just your reflections. They're your mistakes.
1776 will commence again if you try to take our firearms.
1 million of the planet's 8 million species are threatened.
You are what you repeatedly do. Therefore, excellence ought to be a habit, not an act.
Your lives and the credibility of the United Nations is at stake.
Epstein didn't kill himself.
The reason this is such an interesting time is not only because we're on the threshold of the end of this civilization.
They're trying to take you out with bullshit.
The experience of the past 2 years has proven beyond doubt that no nation can appease the Nazis.
To those who can hear me, I say, do not despair. The misery that is now upon us is but the passing of greed, the bitterness of men who fear the way of human progress. The hate of men will pass, and dictators die, and the power they took from the people will return to the people. And so long as men die, liberty will never perish.
In the language of the U.S. Department of Defense, these are unidentified aerial phenomena.
Roswell's a very interesting place with a lot of people that would like to know what's going on.
There is very compelling evidence that we may not be alone.
This is the Garden of Doom.
Welcome everyone into Garden of Doom, and this episode we're welcoming back our old friend Dr. Reverend David Parry, and he is, he's been on the show before, but he is also the founding member or the inspiration, the power behind the Nephilim Anthropology Conference that's coming up. Is it anthropology or is it anthroposophy now?
No. It's still Nephilim Anthropology.
So. Good. I have an easier time pronouncing that word, which is great. And folks, so yes, we're going to talk a little bit about the Nephilim, but we're also going to talk about a bunch of other stuff as well. And hopefully it'll fit into our Spooktober, October, but it's definitely going to tie into the NACON conference, which of course we will mention again at the end of the show. But for those of you who have an interest in giants and the story of Genesis and just really anything to do with the Nephilim and who they are, who they might be from different perspectives, you're going to want to check out the NACON conference, and you can get there. I mean, you could simply Google Nephilim Anthropology Conference and it'll get you there. But the website is https:// the first three letters are capitalized, NACON.eventbrite, eventbrite.co.uk, and the E in Eventbrite is capitalized as well. And the tickets are obviously still available for the virtual. I'm not sure if there are any in-person tickets left if you're in the London area or if you're near the UK and you want to travel there. But David, you could tell us what the ticket prices are?
Firstly, it's a huge honour being back on your show, Jeff. I mean, you've been a stalwart. You've been a true champion of this entire project. Through all of its ups and downs, and I can't tell you how grateful we all are. Me in particular. Yeah, I mean, I'm the honour of being the founder of this bewildering project. But you know, I mean, your support, your gatekeeping activities are fully appreciated and very, very much needed. So it's an honour to be back. Certainly, there are a couple of tickets left in person, which comes to, I don't know the American equivalents, forgive me, £49.99, so roughly £50 for 2 days. the 29th, of course, is the in-person day. We will be live streaming everything, but that's the primary in-person day, excuse me. If you're only going to come along via Zoom, it's a mere £25.
Well, there you go. I can't beat it. And with the strength of the pound these days, us in the U.S., we might get. They may be paying us to attend, but it's been that's my attempt at bad conversion humor. But it's been my pleasure. I thank you for the kind words. But it's been mostly a ton of fun to be involved with the conference and all the people I've met and all the guests that I've had, and it keeps expanding, and it's really helped this show raise its level of the tier of guests. I don't think I would have gotten to some of these folks on my own, maybe ever, but certainly it would have taken years as opposed to months to get the Gary Waynes and the Maria Wheatleys and to the Mark Ollies, and you know, if it wasn't for you and Alan and you know everyone else, and I mean Johan, I mean Luke Michael Ironside, who's one of my favorite guests and one of the favorite guests of the listeners, because all of his shows are still in the top 30, even though some of them are well over a year old, etc. I don't want to name names too much because I'm going to forget them, obviously. And people have come and people go, and people will come back again. But so today's topic, folks, is, you know, the story of the Nephilim starts in Genesis, but Genesis starts with, you know, a certain somebody saying, "Let there be light," and there's angels, and throughout the Bible, and then the ancillary books, some of which are canon, some of which are considered non-canonical or apocrypha, others which are sort of in between, some things like the Book of Enoch, and then you have the mysticism and Kabbalah and Sufism, and everywhere else there's angels, there's demons, there's cherubim, there's seraphim, there's the Malachim, there's the Nephilim, there's the Raphaim, and there's Satan, and there's 7 princes of hell. And I just want to know, who are all of these? Like, what are their relative ranks? Just so this is going to be a celestial beings minus God. We're gonna go with God speaks for itself and is at the top of the heap. But who's everyone else? Who are these 9 choirs of angels? Who are the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse? So I don't know where you want to start. Maybe probably the 9 choirs of angels. Is it 9 different ranks? Like, what's the difference between a cherubim and a seraphim? I think I'll shut up now and just listen.
Well, the trouble is, I mean, it's a theological minefield, as you can imagine. You know, and anybody that's wanted to be anybody has always put their 5 penneth worth in and given a new theory about who everybody is and where everybody stands. And that's not quite as cynical as it sounds. You know, if you're looking at angels, the concept of messengers, heavenly messengers as they originate in ancient Israel, you're looking at something quite rudimentary. I mean, it's obviously tied in with the Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism. I mean, I seem to remember that mysticism was quite a bad word, or a misinterpreted word, or rather a word interpreted in America in a way we didn't use it. It tended to mean crazy guy at one point over there, or somebody on the verge of madness. That's never actually been the way Europeans have used that word. What it tends to imply over here is some sort of depth in consciousness or some sort of height, which is very, very rarely achieved. So you're looking at quite a different interpretation to begin with of what the mystics are doing and where they're coming from. So Jewish mystics, Jewish magicians, some of the highly trained rabbis would have said there are celestial powers. You know, God is the ultimate architect, but he doesn't do his own stonemasonry. He doesn't do his own building. He has people to assist in the building process. And those heavenly powers were designated in certain ways. I mean, and then, of course, a rail breaks out. You know, who's doing what according to the various rabbinical schools. The interesting thing, I suppose, from my point of view, is it changes with history. And again, that's not necessarily people making things up. I mean, it might be a clash of seers through time as things change in other worlds. Certainly Carl Jung, who tends to be my guide in all of this, as opposed to one of the great mystics, would have said, well, no, you're looking at the same material from different angles depending on the century, and what the major scholars, what the zeitgeist of that century actually were, what it was doing. So you come from that quite rudimentary cult of the Jewish God, Jehovah, where, of course, Satan would simply have been adversary in the sense of the prosecuting lawyer. You would have been approaching the throne of the Most High for the great assize at the end of time. The end of time being, of course, your personal time. It didn't mean the world ended all of a sudden, although it came to mean that. It meant when you died, the world ended for you. And there was a prosecuting lawyer saying what a bastard you were. And there's a defending lawyer saying, hang on a minute, he's not all bad, he's a good guy, let's look at the bigger picture. So in the Jewish sources, it tends to start really on that level, very undefined to begin with, really along the model of a courtroom. And that begins to change as the prophets develop what they want to say to Israel. I mean, we've got to remember what the prophets are doing. And certainly they're not simply guys that see into the future. That's one of the hallmarks of the trade, that a prophet is a great moral authority, a great judge. They came to judge Israel as a nation. The idea of individualcy actually was unknown in the ancient world. They wouldn't have thought that way at all. Was a community, what were the children of Israel, living according to these divine ordinances. Are you doing the right thing as you understand it with your neighbour? Are you defending the kingdom of Israel as you understand that? And therefore the prosecuting angel really was speaking against Israel as a whole, not an individual person. That comes a lot later. Whereas the defending lawyers wouldn't really have been the Messiah. That comes a lot later. That guardian angel that looks over your shoulder would have defended you, and the great court would have judged accordingly. It's when you get to Isaiah and strange accusations happening, which show not only the evolution of religious insight, but also the evolution of humanity generally. The prophets start saying your view of God isn't big enough. You've got this tribal view. It's not acceptable. God is bigger than all of this. And that's when you get the fall of various angels from their original estate. Isaiah describes it as one of the heavenly ones. Iniquity was found in thee, and you fell like lightning from heaven. I'm paraphrasing terribly. And that's when you start getting the satanic figure that we know nowadays, which of course sets up a rival court to the court of God and becomes the enemy of the heavenly circles. I'm more comfortable, I suppose, as somebody looking at these things from a Christian perspective, looking at what Christians did with those materials, in the sense that I do know a little about the Jewish background. I know a little about the Islamic development of the Jewish Christian background. I mean, they wanted to introduce a whole new range of entities called the jinn that were made of fire. I mean, they're not of human origin at all. People misunderstand that very much in the West. There are good jinn, there are bad jinn. The really powerful ones, unfortunately for us, tend to be the bad ones. And they're a fact of life in Islamic countries. I mean, even in the very sophisticated cultures I've had the privilege to visit, they all believe in jinn, and they all believe in their interactions with humans. Strange ideas again. You've got a scholar at the moment who's very, very popular, Harun Yahya, who says strange things like, at the end of time we'll have a personal jinn that will do our bidding. And so it mustn't be mistaken that we're dealing with genies. We get the English genie from that.
Right.
The jinn are species, not angelic, but not demonic, that have their own function and their own view of what's going on under the direction of Allah. But they complicate and muddy the waters even further. Christianity, of course, I mean, where do we start with all of this? Let's look at the Catholic model. I mean, you've got 9 circles, 9 hierarchies, the highest orders being the Seraphim, the Cherubim, and the thrones. And we'll get to them in a minute, because most people, you're not looking at beautiful human beings with feathery wings. You're looking at something much more dramatic. You get the middle orders, the dominions, the virtues, and the powers. And you get the lowest orders, the principalities, the archangels, and the angels. So you notice when people are talking about angels, they're actually the lowest outpouring of celestial light. All of that tends to be based upon the Neoplatonic idea, the ideas of Plato and his school of God not really being a being, but being beingness. The origin, the source, the starting point of all creation, the point beyond creation which gives birth to creation. And one of his elements, one of its qualities is abundance. And there's an overflow of divine abundance which goes down the different levels of being and creates, as it overflows, these different hierarchies, these different choirs of angels. And certainly if we actually look at the Bible, some of the encounters with angelic life are more or less horrific. They're certainly the devoted servants of God. They're very far from human. I mean, one of them is described as having a face like lightning, and none of the people encountering it can even look on it. They pass out with fear more or less instantaneously. Some of them are just 6 wings and all feathers and all eyes. I mean, there's nothing anthropomorphic there. So you're looking at beings of a different quality and level to us. And certainly if you're looking at the 2 highest, the Cherubim and the Seraphim, 6 faces, sometimes 4, 6 wings, sometimes more, that are entities way above anything in the created order as we know it, that float forever in a sea of light and bliss, and can barely notice us. I mean, they're not bothered in our existence. They don't think much of us in the first place, if they've noticed at all. And they're simply there as part of the divine overflow, part of the cement building blocks that hold creation on a multi-level view together. So that those are that's the Catholic / Orthodox view of the chain of being. And the Protestant churches, this isn't a crack, this isn't a go, tend to reduce it all to feathery human beings that flit about and take messages. Why not? I mean, that's one of their main functions. But there's a lot more to it than that from the Bible itself. And of course, there's an argument which has haunted the church from the beginning about which books should be included and which should not. I mean, we're looking at different Bibles. The Protestant Bible has 66 books, approximately, sometimes more, sometimes less, whereas the Catholic Church has 60, 67, 68.
Right.
And that's not the same as the Orthodox Bible. What came first, Catholicism historically in the West, but very soon after you get Christian Orthodoxy. And it's arguable. I mean, my last book on Mount Athos, I hoped I made it rather clear that really how did Christianity start as a cult, and there's nothing insulting in saying that, a group of religious people looking for spiritual truth as a small minority in those communities would have been Orthodox. It wouldn't have been Catholic. I mean, if you get an Orthodox monk looking back to the origins of Christianity as it was then, they'd have recognized something Orthodox, not Catholic. So, the whole thing is complicated. It's a mess. Or, is it just deep material that needs to be categorized at some point when somebody, wants to get round of it? The great schools don't do anymore. Gone are the days of the schoolmen in medieval Europe. Gone are the days when they wanted to categorize everything. That's really where all this comes from. And gone are the days when angelology was considered a minor branch of metaphysics, where the great scholars, saints were trying to talk about things that seem to us ridiculous, but aren't really when you get into the mindset, like St. Thomas Aquinas, the great ox of learning. Fatty Aquinas, one of my favourite people, and the ox of learning, as they used to call him, a gigantic brain. The whole of theology and philosophy in the Middle Ages was based on his thinking. And there are people around that want to have a go at that, because he posed the question, how many angels do you get on the end of a pin? And people tend to mock that without actually realise what he's trying to do. He's actually talking in our modern terms about the concept of non-spatial being. What do we mean by existence? What do we mean by manifestation? What do we mean by consciousness? What do we mean by those things? All of which arise from questions like that. It's a very medieval way of configuring those questions. I mean, another one would have been, did Christ own his own clothes? Which translates into modern times into the much more awkward question of, should the church be rich, own property, own paintings, have these huge estates, or should it be serving the community through house churches in poverty? Should it be doing that through the goodwill of ministers in their own local homes and communities? So they had a different way of organising questions in those days, but mostly it comes down to quite profound questions about things we're still arguing on today. Does that help at all,
Jim? No, I think it confuses me even more, which I think was sort of the point. I guess the answer is that it depends who you're asking, who they are. There's no simple answer now, but if I understood correctly, the angels that most people know of, your angel of death, your Archangel Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, those names, they're sort of in that lower third.
Yeah. The great chain of being would work on the fact that there's a hierarchy of being, and therefore angels, as we normally see them and perceive them on Christmas cards, in movies.
Sure.
The nice guy with the charming smile who will sort things out. They're really only a step or two above us, and with Swedenborg as an example, a unique cultural treasure. Swedenborg can claim to be the only European shaman, the only Western shaman we ever had. A naturalist who started having visions. A man of immense scientific learning and attainments that towards the end of his life started to claim, well, actually, much to my surprise, along with everybody else's, I'm beginning to see other worlds. And he does what a naturalist does. He documents 30 years. And you get very strange ideas, like actually human beings become that type of angel. We're in a sort of transition process. We start as an idea in the chain of being before we're actually born. We become manifest through our parents, through our community, through the people who love us. But we actually evolve on the next level up into angelic life. That's our destiny. So, it gets very, very complex. It really depends on the scholar you're talking to, and also what their credentials are. Are they simply logicians moving categories and logical questions about to answer a particular philosophical or theological problem? Or are they visionaries? Are they mystics who claim some sort of direct interaction with those types of beings?
Let's go with some of the commonly known figures in this world. So probably one of the first angels we encounter is the angel that guards the Garden of Eden after Adam and Eve are cast out. And I believe that's described as a cherub. And so in all of the paintings, it looks like a human man with a fire sword. But the description of cherub, as you're describing, it wouldn't look like a human man at all. There'd be 6 wings and 4 heads and something like that. Or am I misremembering?
No, actually, you're very, very to the point. I mean, you've got to remember the concept of the devil. Really, as we understand it, emerges in late medieval Europe, arguably mid-medieval, but I'd suggest late medieval Europe, when you get sort of the horned adversary of everything good and his minion,
Oh, we'll get to the devil. I assure you of that. We will get to that, because Lucifer is one of the ones I asked a question about. But I I guess the easiest answer is the paintings were wrong. The paintings, they just went with what they, they didn't go by what the book said. They went by what they could paint.
Yeah, I think they've got to be fair to the artists. I mean, how on earth do you paint something like that? They wanted to make a dramatic depiction that was comprehensible to the people around them. Only the theologians really have known what they were actually meant to be dealing with. An artist has a completely different set of problems. And to be fair to them, they've got to do something. Also, they were paid mostly by the church. In which case the church would have wanted to say, anybody looking at your painting won't know what you're talking about. Can you change that, please?
Right.
If you're going to paint some monstrosity with some sort of, what's the sort of fire? If you don't want to paint that, then it's basically incomprehensible in a painting. Therefore, there's no moral instruction in that painting. There's no spiritual advice or guidance in that painting. And the patrons of the church that wanted those things in their art wouldn't really have thought that was a job well done. So to be fair to the artist, I mean, there are one or two bizarre exceptions that we're always on the verge of being heretics anyway. No, they had to keep to a particular formula, because that's not only what their sponsors wanted, but they were very aware that they were doing a moral work and not just an artistic work.
Okay. So Malach, I believe, means messenger. So is Malachim just sort of a overarching term for angels that they all serve as some sort of messenger, or is Malach a particular angel, and is Malachim a particular class or rank?
No, you're looking at classes and ranks. I mean, like Michael, Michael isn't actually a single angel, it's a class and rank of angels.
Oh.
And certainly, I mean, mystics and scholars like Rudolf Steiner are very, very good on that. If we're looking at the concept of an adept, someone that has a real working knowledge, more than a theoretical knowledge of these circles, of these things, I mean, he instantly comes to mind as someone who only died recently, who claims to have had that insight, those interactions, and the academic skill to categorize it all. Therefore, certainly, the Gabriel angels are a rank. So are the Raphael and so on. I mean, along with the angels of death. I mean, it's a rank of angels. Azrael is a rank of angels who are meant to be our helpers. Obviously, it's a time of transition. Most people, we have to take it as read, do not want that transition. Unless they're unworldly saints, maybe, or they've had problems, or they've got sicknesses, all of which is completely understandable. Therefore, that's when sort of the sugary, sweet imagery turns up. And arguably, again, that turned up quite early in artistic depictions, simply because of the material the artists were dealing with. So, you get the comforter, you get the angelic hand on the shoulder, you get sort of somebody with wings, flying you as the soul into the realms of light. Because it's such a traumatic experience, obviously the biggest trauma a human being can ever go through. So that rank, that stream of angelic lives, was depicted in that way to try and ease, the sugar on the pill, the sugar on the nut, because people trying to ease the idea of the transition. Actually, I think that's quite legitimate. So, it's not some grim reaper that's meant to show up sickle in hand, severing your life whether you like it or not. I mean, that idea turns up a lot later. Mm-hmm. It's helpers and friends and cousins in the other world that just happen to be not entirely human, guiding us to the next stage. Either you take the idea that God is a God of us seriously, or you don't. If God is something along the lines of a judge and a lawyer, then you get one opinion of what that is, but why leave it there? Why not some sort of school mistress? It depends what model of God you're working with. If, however, I would say you're working from the point of view of love, I mean, and why do I say that? Let's look at what Jesus Christ himself says in the New Testament. The main point of what he's saying are the 8 Beatitudes. Bless those who curse you, love those who hate you, Therefore, you're looking at a God of love. You're looking at a God of wisdom. You're not looking at this very unfair judge that basically gives human beings standards they can't possibly ever live up to, and then finding us in the wrong. There's something illogical in that. There's something inhuman in that. I can think of human beings that would do better than that. But, so we're not, God is a term, a title term at the end of the day. It's not a name. I mean, the name, Jehovah is a name. Right. Yeshua is a name. God means literally the sovereign. It means the sovereign of the universe, the ultimate being, the supreme being. Therefore, to have earned that name, to be worthy of that epithet, you must be actually, deserving of that title. And, and to look at some of the depictions of God floating around at the moment, there is no way that particular depiction is even human, let alone anything divine. So we've got to start, from what particular model are we looking at, and then how things pan out from there. You couldn't have Jesus calling God Father, Daddy. I mean, Abba must translate as Daddy, which scandalized the rabbis of his day, who wanted somebody like, the leader of the Sanhedrin, who could make decisions on behalf of Israel, and would eventually send the Messiah, of course, who would be a military conqueror. The king of Israel was not only a prophet, but also a military conqueror. Mm-hmm. So they're still waiting for the Messiah, who will deliver Israel once and for all from its enemies and put all of the rest of us under its yoke. I mean, that's the tradition in the mainstream. Whereas Christians started developing different traditions based on the outpourings of the apostles of the New Testament, which were basically anarchist communities. I mean, people tend to get the idea nowadays of how these books were composed completely wrongly. I mean, you're dealing with ordinary people without any resources. Paper was incredibly expensive to produce. A papyrus, a document, wouldn't have been within the range of ordinary people or ordinary synagogues. You'd have needed somebody like, the emperor in Rome to basically pay for it and authorize it. You'd have needed the Sanhedrin in Israel, a lesser organization, simply wouldn't have had the resources to do that. And if you're going to all that expense and then you need scribes, your view is going to cause a lot of energy, and it's going to use a lot of resources in the community. I mean, they had things called Masoretic texts in those days. Everything was memory. Nowadays, we're skeptical of that for the wrong reasons. How much should I remember about yesterday or last week? But actually, mnemonics was a whole science in the ancient world, and you would be tested on a text that you were going to memorize, not only forwards but backwards. And let's consider the example of the rabbis. They would suddenly ask one of the aspirants to answer a question about the middle of the text when they'd be talking about the beginning of the text, and they were expected to answer. So this whole intellectual industry was going on in the ancient world. If we take the Gospels at face value, they were very ordinary men and women, mostly. I mean, Luke was a doctor, truly. But, ordinary men and women who felt something of spectacular value, unique value had happened in their lives. And they wanted to share that after a great deal of discussion and division. Not all of them thought that the church could survive or should survive. Maybe it should be just a corrective to Israel. The original people of Jesus were called the Jesus people. You get something called Q-text, the sayings of a savior, the sayings of a teacher. And Jesus would have been seen as either a wisdom teacher, a philosopher, or literally the Son of Man. That is confused nowadays. We're all sons of God, all of us. The ancient world was very aware of that. When Jesus says the Son of Man, he's actually making a divine claim. That was not a title used for everybody. That's where the modern world tends to get a little, cut the cart before the horse. I was just about to use that wonderful British saying, arse about face, but I'm on a show speaking as a clergyman, so I must say that. So you've got the problem of the resources, you've got the problem of the view of the original Christians, all of whom, the majority of whom tended to see this as a school amongst the Israelis, correcting what the Israelis themselves, the children of Israel, were about. I mean, certainly there are extra evidences of that, like Jesus is constantly referring to the book of Daniel, either directly or indirectly. He's also referring to one of the rabbis of his day, who was very well known, learned Rabbi Hillel, who was a Jewish theologian and a lawyer, who was constantly critiquing, what we would call the quisling Sanhedrin on its knees to Rome all the time. Yes, Caesar, no Caesar. And so, where is all this leading? We all know they're a ruthless military power. I mean, they're going across the world causing massacre after massacre. Why are we even talking to them? So all that is going on, and Jesus certainly approves of all of that. Which leads me back. The apostles felt they wanted to testify to something of superlative worth that had happened in their lives. People crowd around them, and small communities start. And it's that teacher, that mystagogue, that adept, surrounded by disciples. That's how the Gospels and the early writings were gathered together. And that's why some of them are actually remarkably early, if you're looking at these texts as oral texts, which they were originally. The big argument nowadays is, when was it written down? Oh my God, that late, that shows it knows nothing. That wouldn't have arisen in the ancient world. They were written down when they had the resources to write them down, but they were discussing either whole Gospels or bits of the Gospel, nearly directly after the life of Jesus Christ. So that's a wrong way of looking at it. And of course, it's when that gospel begins to spread, and it spread like wildfire, because you're looking at something very libertarian. You're looking at something incredibly humane. We are all equal. That was not an assumption in the ancient world. I mean, I can't think of any Anglo-American or European culture that thinks that way, but that's because of the Bible. If I get on a bus or I get on the tube over here, I assume everybody around me is of equal worth and value to me. But if I go to India, that is not the assumption. I am more human than the outcast. I'm more human than the Shudra. I'm more human than the caste beneath me. They were born less human than me, and they should pay me the correct respect. So that levelling power in human society, which comes directly out of the Judeo-Christian tradition, which comes directly out of Islam, which comes from basically Abraham, the prophet Abraham, to start saying, we're all children of the same source, of the same God. That was felt as an incredibly important message. Certainly the Romans wouldn't have thought that. And all of a sudden, the children of Israel as tribal worshippers of, oh God, this will be taken the wrong way, of a tribal God, are suddenly seen as much more than that, contributing to what Abraham himself says, one day a great blessing will come to all the world through Israel, which of course he was alluding to the Messiah. And the Christians come along and say, well, that's happened. That's happened. And what is the Messiah? A wisdom teacher, a healer. And he's told us something of great truth that nobody knows and nobody realizes. We're all equal, and we need to start looking after each other a bit better. So that's how these texts started. And of course, other questions begin to arise, but not originally. As things go on, as this process, this philosophical process unfolds. I'm always fuzzy about the difference between, personally, theology and philosophy. I mean, I got 3 degrees in theology. But if I look back to the first one I did, so that was what they call nowadays the history of ideas. So, is that philosophy or is that theology? Because most of the people who contributed to abstract human knowledge through the centuries were the theologians or theologists. Now we call them philosophers, but that simply wasn't the correct designation. Right. So, as the process unfolds, other questions arise, secondary questions, tertiary questions. How can a good God allow evil in the world? Is there a source of evil? What is the source of evil? Why do human beings die? Are there other realms of being? Is this all there is? Is there something else? They had the same questions in those days that we do, and sometimes at a much more sophisticated and evolved level than we've got. I mean, there was a survey done a year or so ago in London about literacy levels in London, and we were found currently to be underneath the average citizen in ancient Rome.
Oh, wow.
We've got to remember our ancestors weren't stupid. They put their energy and their time into different areas of life. Doesn't mean they were stupid. They were asking questions. And that's why certain branches of knowledge are incredibly advanced as we find them in our time. But they're not really the type of questions that general people ask now. And also, I mean, this will get me hated off your show, Jeff. If you look at what's happened to Christianity, I mean, it's certainly right. Is it healing anybody nowadays? I take the Bible literally. Okay, are you feeding the world, or are you just being a pain in the arse? Religion itself, Christianity itself, sadly tends to be reduced to an ideological system. I mean, what some ministers in some denominations have to do, fill in a checklist of do you believe this or do you believe that, which would have been nonsense to anyone in the ancient world, and should be now to anyone with half a brain. Actually what you're doing is memorizing and defending an ideology, a particular view of life, as opposed to religion, which we tend to see, because the ancients would have seen it that way, as the depth of life. You're exploring the depth, you're exploring the complexities of what it means to be human and what that implies in itself. So, evil, other types of being, why are we all here? What's the world made of? What does it mean? Is there any meaning to life? Those are the deep core religious questions, which nowadays sadly are falling beneath the ideological strain and beneath answers that aren't really answers. Because nobody wants to acquaint themselves really with the book. And I know it's sounding terribly cynical. It must be because it's so late in Britain. I don't know. But I hope I'm answering some of it for you, Joe.
Well, I'm gonna add to the problem, because I'm not going to try to answer any of those big questions, which are all completely beyond me, or at least for anyone else, perhaps. I think the first goal is everyone answers it for themselves, I guess. But I want to get to I don't know. I'll call it the fun stuff. It's probably not fun from your perspective necessarily, but before I forget, first of all, who is Metatron?
Oh, well, actually, that's Enoch. Right, let's get to it. I mean, certainly UFO people. I've actually seen a UFO. I was a kid in a playground. I grew up in Hampshire, Fareham in Hampshire. This lovely, leafy, rural, reasonably affluent area, and we were in the beginnings of secondary school. It was, a market town. I don't know if people over there know much about British market towns. Very civilized, but rough and ready. Ordinary working people, working hard, but good people. The food was good. The landscapes were full of trees and rivers, and it was a lovely, lovely place to grow up. We were all at the beginning of a private school. I went to a private school for the simple reason there were no other schools in the vicinity. So, it wasn't an elitist choice, it was a practical choice. And Mrs. Smith, a woman I remember to this day, was the headmistress, a live wire, whoever there was, who believed in educating people through fun and through working out what they were interested in and taking it from that level. I remember all the other teachers hating her because they were afraid of her. This very bright patrician woman who actually believed in educating children, perished the thought. So all that was going on. And we, as I say, were all in the playground, and a silvery disc, completely silent in the classic sense. You get the hub above the source of it, started flying over the playground. And the reaction of everybody was unbelievable. Instantaneous psychology. You know what a person is during a crisis. So some kids ran off screaming, the cowards. Some started fighting. Look, there are always some, aren't there? And I myself and one or two of the other kids were staring at this thing. It was staggeringly beautiful. It was glittering in a perfectly clear sky, blue and clear in every direction, not a cloud in sight, and we couldn't believe it. It was quite high, but we couldn't believe it, and it was very visible. Now, that has to be balanced against the fact, obviously, I was a kid at school, so I hadn't read Carl Jung. Also, we were near the city of Portsmouth, which is a naval base. Mm-hmm. so one mustn't rule out obvious answers. My belief in education, formal education, usual education, was destroyed that day. We ran into the teachers who were having tea, it was their tea break, and said, right, okay, there's a flying saucer flying over the playground, you didn't come to see it. They all said no, they were in tea break. And we tried, so there's a miracle going on, they don't want to see it. So we tried everything, including begging, they wouldn't come out. So we watched it float off into the distance. The bell was rung. They used to do things like that in those days. We all went back into class, and the first thing that was said was, we want no talk of any UFOs. So that was that. Which meant I didn't believe in education for years. I mean, I did my studying, formal studying, later than lots of people, although that was a choice back then, simply because I didn't believe these people knew a thing. And I'm still not entirely certain. How do we tie that in with the rest? Yeah, therefore, are there, to my mind, UFOs, flying saucers? Yes, because I've seen one. Does that mean, as Eric von Daniken says, they're everywhere in the Bible? No, it does not. If we take, we're obviously edging towards Genesis 6, and we're edging to Ezekiel. Certainly there are, we've got to remember the Bible was not written in English.
Right.
It was written in Greek from Hebrew originals. And there were whole councils, there were whole groups of scholars arguing the point about words, some words that couldn't even be translated properly, let alone the meaning of paragraphs, the meaning of certain books. Everything was done by committee, because how else can you translate a religious text? A religious text, by definition, isn't like a novel, it's not like a play, it's not like a scientific treatise. It's meant to be the type of writing that's multi-leveled in origin. It's poetry, it's morality, in other words, moral philosophy, it's history sometimes, it's religious conjecture. So, how on earth do you get all of that into a translation? And the answer is you don't. But, people try, and good on them. And also there's an argument amongst the Jews about what type of Hebrew these things were originally written in. So the arguments go on and on and on. All of the original documents, of course, have long since been destroyed. Therefore, there's no way of referring to any of the originals for two reasons. The texts themselves have either crumbled with the course of time, or they were deliberately destroyed by rival factions, or they were mnemonic texts. They were never actually physical texts in the first place.
Right.
And shame on all of us for allowing that to happen. Yeah, and the Bible is not the only victim of that temporal process. But it's probably the most surprising victim, bearing in mind what it is and what it's saying. But that happened. Anyway, in 90% of the Bible, when it wants to talk about angels, the Greek word, because I had to start with Greek, angeloi is used, right? Which must mean what we mean by angel, which must mean something like messenger. A couple of times in the Bible, that is not there. And you get weird statements which were obviously agreements by the group of translators who didn't know how to translate the word. So let's say Genesis 6, you have the Watchers. If the Watchers were angels, why didn't they just say angeloi and make their own life easy? They didn't do that. They said, no, the Watchers, those who fly above. Why not say angels? But they didn't want to say angels. There are outbursts in the Bible for UFO phenomena. I personally think this is one of them. And you end up with a very strange story. Certainly modern evangelicals, with their somewhat alternative view of history and their alternative view of moral philosophy, and that's not a dig. Everyone's entitled to their opinion. Their view of what biblical narrative is, how it unpacks into the modern world. They would say, okay, it comes from the time when the disciples approached Jesus, and they say, again, a very human question. How will we know when the age is ending? How will we know when the world ends? So not just an individual. And Jesus does respond by saying, as in the days of Noah, so will the passing of the Son of Man be. So you have to look back to Genesis 6 and look at what was happening in the days of Noah. And you end up with a very strange story. You don't end up with what we think we're looking at. Certainly it's not just Noah's Ark. You get the children of Israel fighting for their very survival against foes that we would really consider not entirely human. And their parents, their parenting powers, the Watchers decide to descend to Earth and have congress with human women. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean simple sexual activity. It can mean all sorts of things, but congress. And children were born. Those are the Nephilim. Now, whether they're actually giants or not is a moot point. I mean, certainly the word gigantes is used, where we get the word giant from, but it might mean something to do with, sort of non-human status. It might mean, you're just a huge bastard. It might mean something along those lines as opposed to physical height. But certainly, so the Watchers descend, the Nephilim, this forbidden union takes place, whatever it was, and the forbidden offspring suddenly then start to appear, who are the enemies of Israel. And that's when you start getting weird subtextual stories, most of which are not in the Bible, they're in the apocryphal literatures. That the Watchers realised that they had been cursed by the Most High, and their work had been cursed by the Most High, because they transgressed, they crossed a Rubicon, they crossed a barrier they simply shouldn't have done. So they start giving knowledge to human beings to try and survive, their humanity, their children to try and survive. And, and that includes black magic, it includes sorcery, it includes warfare. So you get all this going on in the days of Noah, and really Noah's Ark, whether that's meant to be taken literally or not. I mean, I think you know me, Jeff, I certainly don't take it literally. Lots of people do. And that does seem to be the intention of the author. But if you look back to the text in those days, that's not necessarily as revealing as it seems to be. In other words, this is a hard fable, this is a hard myth that you will pay attention to. Even that's built because the rising flood waters are trying to wipe away a mistake. They're trying to wipe away something that should not have occurred but did occur, and this was the only way of dealing with that. In the created order that we've got, that's known as the world, and the environment we've got, that was the only way of dealing with it. So all that is going on during the days of Noah. UFOs, kidnapping people, alien abduction and the probe and all the rest of it, which of course some of the evangelicals say is happening now. I don't know about all that, but I'm aware something's going on. So that is how we get the Nephilim into this picture. I mean, for me, it's not an overpowering story. It's an interesting story. But, is it to do with the moral philosophy that the Bible's really all about, that it's written about? No. Therefore, can we talk about the mainstream? Can we talk about the main bit? So, the Nephilim Anthropology Conference, for me, is a good project. It's a fun idea. But I can't say it's any type of witness or religious statement. For me, personally, it's not. Some of our fellow panelists do think that.
Yes.
And that's okay as well. That's great too. But I can't see, for me personally, it is. I just thought it was a good idea and it needed exploring and thrashing out. It is linked, all of this is linked with the secondary and tertiary Jewish materials. In Islam, what would you call it? You call it the Hadith. It's not the Quran. Sayings and stories and scenarios that are not sacred, that are not canonical in the biblical sense, in the Quranic sense. So they're collected together, but and there are experts on that secondary and tertiary material, but it's not for prime thrust. The Jews have the same thing. We do. We have apocryphal materials, but nowadays they're out of fashion. Enoch, the most mystical thing in the whole of the Bible, according to the rabbis, is really a couple of lines. Enoch walked with God, and Enoch was not, because God took him. Right. That is very, very, very odd, because that doesn't imply death. It implies some sort of transcendence of being, which is suddenly attained, achieved, or given. And a human being suddenly becoming much more than a human being, in the twinkling of an eye. And that's what was meant to be. It wasn't a violation of those principles. It was what happened. That figure returns later as the Archangel Metatron, who is a very strange figure indeed, because there's still a lot of the human in Metatron. She goes around heaven asking questions and interceding for the human race. Some of the apocryphal stories are absolutely bizarre. I mean, my favourite one, in the sense that I think they're getting at something not usually discussed, is the Metatron questioned the Archangels about what the nature of God was, and took notes, and took classes with all the Archangels, and ends up hundreds of years later saying to them all, "But if I add up everything you're saying, there must be two gods." And the story goes, the angels are so horrified they lashed him with a whip of fire for 1,000 years. Is that meant to be taken literally? No, it's not. At least I don't think it is.
Right.
But the symbolism, the semiosis, the semiotics of that story are stretching way beyond what that story itself is actually saying. So it's worthy of interest, and it's worthy of what became known as the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch, again, isn't canonical. Some people say it should be. I think the historical grounds for that are extraordinarily shaky. It's something to do with biblical narrative. It's certainly not inspired. Right, what does that mean? It means a group of scholars believe that a depth of consciousness was achieved, a height of consciousness was achieved by the author who's seeing more deeply, and they don't necessarily mean anything supernatural, but they were seeing more deeply or being allowed to see information and topics at the sort of depth which isn't given to most people 99% of the time.
Right.
So that was not included, I think, for quite valid reasons. Where, of course, you get sort of further information fleshed out. So what happened after the Watchers descended? What happened after the Congress took place? What type of knowledge did the Watchers give? What happened to them? What happened to their offspring, some of whom are the Nephilim, who may or may not have been the tall beings with 2 sets of teeth and 6 hands and 6 toes. I mean, that may not have been them. I mean, all of this is being added on through time. And that's not to say it's not implied, but certainly it's added on through time. It's not in the original. Valid questions that book explores, but at the end of the day, still it's not canonical. And it was decided that it shouldn't be, because it raises, not only is its own status questionable amongst inspired texts, but it raises the sort of questions that are just leading in the wrong direction. Will a study of Aleister Crowley's book of Magic in Theory and Practice lead you to higher consciousness? Some of us will say no. It's anything on magic and occultism, as fascinating as it is, isn't leading you into realization. It's leading you away from that in a certain way. So the theologians, the theologists that decided on the canon, in my view, quite rightly thought, no, that's not really what we're getting at. So it floats around, and it's very interesting, and it ends up being a source text for what was that awful movie, Noah? Who played Noah again?
The Russell Crowe. Yeah.
Oh my God, I can't stand him at the best of times anyway. But the most unconvincing Noah I've ever seen in my life. I think it was Chuck Missler, a man I admire no end. I'm not sure I've had much to agree with him about, but I admire his testimony, I admire his witness. And all of a sudden, the prophet Noah's made into the burning. How did that happen? You're looking at materials that are very, very rich and very interesting, but they lack a certain depth and religious cutting edge. So that's Metatron.
There's one down. So I guess we'll get to Satan, who I think, most people consider Lucifer and Satan to be synonyms. I guess once Lucifer fell out of favor, you sort of assumed the title of Satan as adversary. But Lucifer was, I think they said, on the right side, the right hand, basically the right-hand man of God, obviously not a man. But what would Lucifer have been a seraphim or a cherubim, or would Lucifer have been more like a archangel level? Because it seems like it should be one of the earlier names.
Oh no, this is one of the earliest. I mean, depending on the rabbinical school you're actually addressing, or the Christian community you're thinking of. I mean, certainly that entity. Certain people simplify it, again, like Chuck Missler, and that's no disrespect to him at all. A remarkable man and a man of great knowledge. But he could simplify the text when he wasn't sure what it was they were actually trying to say. I mean, for Chuck and certain evangelicals, Lucifer, which of course would mean beautiful light, was the choir master in heaven. And, you know, the leader of celebrations around the throne, until iniquity was found in him, and he was cast out of heaven. And, you know, again, you get Isaiah talking about the fall like lightning from heaven to earth. I actually think there's a lot hidden behind that. So Lucifer loses the heavenly name and becomes Satan, but of course that just means adversary. So you've got the choir master who becomes the adversary not only of God but of humanity generally.
Would he have been a seraph? I'm saying he, and a cherub. Yeah, a cherub. Okay, so what's essentially the difference between a cherub and a seraph?
Well, not only a lessening of being, a lessening of power. Evil in the sense it's normally described nowadays actually isn't that Christian. You know, if you see a movie baddie, I don't know, you see, gosh, I'm trying to think of a great baddie. I don't know, Professor Moriarty in Sherlock Holmes or something. You know, a man given to doing the wrong thing because he's just like that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that isn't really what Christianity's saying. As you fall away from the divine presence, you lose the divine qualities. So you lose intelligence, you lose beauty, you lose truth, you lose goodness, until you end up this vacant irrelevancy at the bottom of things. That really is one of the original views of what falling away from the divine presence means. Not this operatic demon going around causing nausea everywhere. I mean, that's quite a new thing.
Right, the red horns and all that in the town.
I mean, and all of that gets confused with ancient paganism, of course.
Right.
I mean, you know, the horned one probably had his prototype in the god Pan, who, of course, was not a malevolent entity, was not a malevolent story. I mean, you know, the god of the woodlands, you know, the god of trees and forests and wild things, and certainly not malevolent. You know, boisterous, amusing, full of knowledge. Pan, of course, would have been one of the original ways of referring to the world's soul amongst the philosophers, the one universal life that connects us all. Therefore, it was the secret behind the gods themselves, which is why the gods were always in two minds about how to deal with Pan, because Pan, at the end of the day, outranked them. And, you know, when you get stories from the ancient world of somebody surfacing after some time in meditation and reading, hearing a voice saying the great god Pan is dead, actually what you're listening to is a clash of mystery schools. So, you know, what that word means and how the word's interpreted, yada, yada, yada. So the operatic devil we're presented with nowadays, Satan, literally means the enemy. And that is how the figure evolved from being the adversary in God's court. In other words, a true servant of God whose job it was to uphold, to present the court with all the things that people didn't want to hear. And he did this and he did that. You know, and this was wrong, because that's the job of a prosecutor. From that, we've now got the enemy, not only of the heavenly court, but of humanity in general. So the devil, the prince of darkness, really becomes more of a Manichaean figure. I mean, that really is the philosophy and theology haunting all of this. Let me give you an aside for a minute. Certainly you never hear a word against the Persians in any of the scriptures, any of the Jewish scriptures, any of the Christian scriptures, because it all goes back. One of the major influences on all of those texts is Zoroastrianism, from the prophet Zoroaster, who of course started Zoroastrianism as a religion in Persia and those lands. And it was the Persians, that, of course, who liberated the children of Israel from the tyrannical Babylon. There were no redeeming features and higher order values in Babylon. It was a bit like ancient Rome, all to do with, oh my God, modern Britain. You know, all to do with power and privilege. Get out my way and I outrank you. That's what their whole society was built on. That was seen as abhorrent by the Jews, by the children of Israel. And the Persians come along with their much more enlightened view of human life and set them free. And of course, the Bible had been effectively destroyed in Babylon. Its slave peoples weren't allowed to be literate. The Jews were always very literate, simplifying things, but because we're on a popular program, and I can go into that at some other point with you if you like. Yeah, at some other time. But certainly as a people that prized knowledge, as a people that prized what we would call literacy, that was discouraged by violence, by deliberate oppression in their empire. And so a lot of the original biblical texts were destroyed and lost. And the great genius of the Old Testament is Ezra the priest, who says once liberation has started, okay, what is left? What have we got left of what we remember, of what we knew, how we used to worship God, the practices, the rites, what do we remember? Can we write it all down? Can we finally get to the stage where we codify our resources and get them together? And that's how we end up with what we know as the Old Testament. That is not. Does that mean that all this is all of it's a victim to history? No, it doesn't. It means that's the flow of history. God is more than capable of rewriting a Bible. The Spirit is more than capable of inspiring people again to see those insights. As a historical process, however, that's the way the world goes, which leads me back to Zoroaster. I read the Agathos. It's a lengthy poem, basically, written by Zoroaster when I was an undergraduate. I had to put it down because it was so modern. But it's written in the Bronze Age. I found the whole thing incredibly uncomfortable. Beautiful poetry, but the thought schemes, the thought world that was behind it was very sophisticated, very modern. I found the whole thing incredibly unsettling. A couple of years later, I went back to it and discovered something of immense importance. What Zoroaster is saying, as arguably one of the first prophetic figures of the human race, is that the Indians, the people of Asia, those peoples, are going around with these new weapons called bronze weapons, metal weapons, and the world is turning into a bloodbath. Therefore, therefore what they worship, the devas, simply cannot be good. And no heavenly power would sanction this bloodbath, these massacres, nobody. So he reverses, in a sense, the mythological stories of those peoples and says that the devas are now devils. You have to understand them that way. They are not working towards the light. They're not working to the betterment of anything. And they hate people, and their way of dealing with people is destruction, violence, and death. And the Asuras, which become the angels, they become the principalities, the powers, the cherubim, the seraphim of light. And he starts what most people think is a dualistic religion. Try to use non-inflammatory language, but I'm not sure I can. You're looking at the type of religion where you get really clear divisions between right, wrong, good, bad, light, darkness. And he would have gone on to say, look, how do we know what's good for us as human beings? In the darkness, things wither and die. In the light, they prosper and they grow stronger. Therefore, we've got to strive to be children of light. We've got to strive to follow those powers, because ultimately we're their children. And it's that type of theology that runs all the way through the scriptures, Jewish and Christian, and has informed so much of the modern world. It even informs modern writers like Dennis Wheatley. Of course, Maria Wheatley is one of our participants in 2 weeks' time.
Yep.
But it informs nearly all of modern occultism. There's a war going on between right and wrong. There's a struggle, and where do you stand in the struggle? That sort of Manichaean, dare I say, duality is there from the beginning, to the extent that it was found to be uncomfortable. But if you look at some Victorian Bibles, the story of the Magi was actually removed. Mostly Protestant Bibles, that's not me having a dig, that's a simple fact, because it raised unfortunate questions. Why would God allow 3 pagan priests who had something to do with astrology to be some of the people who saw the infant Jesus from the word go? And why would God allow that? how can you have three practicing magicians in the very presence of the infant Christ? But I mean, it was there in the original. And they were led by a star, which is probably a metaphor. In other words, their knowledge of the stars, of what we would call astrotheology, allowed them to calculate where this incarnation of light was about to occur. And they take three symbolic gifts to show that, the very sources, some of the sources of all of the holy texts were represented by three people who understood that point of origin at the very birth of the Saviour. All these are remarkable things, remarkable developments, which leads me back to the devil. Really, after just before the Middle Ages, as the Christian texts themselves are still forming, you get a solidification in the text of what the devil is, what his function is, what his job is, which again reflects back on the translation of the text, New Text. But he becomes this arch rival of God and the heavenly powers, and the source of all evil, which is now much more active. You get active evil, not simply the passive view of evil I was describing a minute ago, falling away from divine grace, whereby you lose all the attributes of the divine. Now it becomes a much more angry, violent, wicked, pernicious entity that has nothing but the willful destruction of the human race in mind as a way of hurting God. Because, we've got to remember, on one level, none of us matter in these scriptures. We're only human. We're in the middle of a Star Wars, and we're the pawns. Can we be manipulated one way or the other? Sorry for dragging a movie into it, but, if you like, Star Trek would be Buddhism. This sort of slow unfolding of ever great discovery. Whereas Zoroastrianism must be Star Wars, this battle going on all the time between the goodies and the baddies. I mean, that's a fair representation, I think. And that's when you get the sort of operatic devil from the Middle Ages onwards, who's going around the world causing trouble and really not being a good guy at all, until, of course, he takes the final incarnation, at the risk of being misunderstood, in the writings of Goethe, in the writings of the Romantics and Decadents, whereby he becomes this sort of sinister defender of the human race. Because, God gives you all these rules and all these things you can't live up to. Why not just be a total bastard and rebel like me? And you end up with very unsavoury views of what's going on, which basically muddy the moral waters of Scripture even further. So that's the devil. That's a rough history of the devil and his minions, and it goes back, curiously nowadays, to the original view. The darkness is a living force. It's not just the absence of light. It's a source of power. It's a source of energy. It's consciousness. And certain people can draw immense personal power from the service of that particular force. Light is also a force and a power, and it's up to us which direction we choose, because if you look at what the modern Zoroastrians are saying, by which I mean the last 1,000 years, the Great War will not continue forever. Already the realms of light are beginning to close, using metaphors here, the great gate between manifest creation and what goes on up there, and they're doing their best to reach out to all the people here. We belong in those realms. But that war won't go on forever, and it's already beginning to come to a close. So you've got back to the very beginning of the forces of light against the forces of darkness, and humanity caught in this no man's land in the middle of it all.
That is dramatic. I have a question for you on the Seraphim, because I know that in a lot of circles, maybe most notably evangelical, maybe not, that they're equated with the serpents and reptilians and this, that, and the other thing. Now, my understanding of the Seraphim is that, no, they had some 4 heads, 6 heads. One might have been a lizard, one was a human, one was a lion, one was a bull, one was an eagle, whatever. So is there anything serpentine, particularly about the Serafs? And I know that the answer is it depends who you're talking to. Let's just go in the most accepted version of, Judeo-Christianity?
Well, again, there'd be a difference between those two schools.
Ah.
But, the word Seraph means flying serpent, which originally wasn't really negative or malevolent at all. It was a description of sky serpents. It was a description of those powers that really not only served God, but their own ends as well. And, of course, therefore they're judged. Are they doing the right thing, or are they not doing the right thing? Are they just feathering their own nests? But it seems to go back to very ancient Hebrew tribal mysteries, the very origins of it all, whereby the serpentine energies of the earth, the ley lines and all that sort of stuff, the energies they saw in those patterns and forms were discussed. Therefore they're celestial in one sense, in the sense they're not human. Some of whom are in the sky, some of whom are on the earth. But they go about their own business in their own way. I mean, I know certain people are going around calling them reptilians. I mean, that's not really what the original story would have meant. And again, if you're looking for that sort of thing, I don't know why demonology isn't raising its very ugly head. Angelology is being ripped apart by various people. But demonology was also a medieval science. I mean, there's enough there to start talking about these reptiles without dragging heavenly powers down.
Right, without blaming the poor seraphim in that. And that's great, because I wanted to get into demonology, and I wasn't really sure where to start. So I figured that the Seven Princes of Hell probably was a good place to start.
I mean, you've got to remember, I mean, I like Milton. I like the poet Milton. I mean, he's the guy that gives psychologies to all these entities. The Seven Princes of Hell, the servants, the direct servants of Satan, really go back to a prototype in Dante, which Milton sort of comments on as a brother poet, but feels Dante is too Catholic, therefore he's misunderstood what's going on. I think that's really unfair, because really they're coming from different points of view about the same topic. But the Princes of Hell represent all the things that go horribly wrong in the created order, disruption, vissiparity, chaos. And they, of course, have got their own servants that lead to death, war, destruction. In other words, the dark energies marshalled by the satanic figure in his war against the Most High. I mean, certainly Lucifer would mean something like pride, as it's used by that time. Beelzebub would be something like envy. Sanathas would be wrath. Abaddon would be sloth. Mammon, greed. Belphegor, I mean, that would be something like gluttony, I suppose. And Asmodeus, lust. So you're looking at personifications that the enemy is using. The entification, that's also a concept that's fallen out of favour at the minute, that the enemy uses against the human race. The idea in the ancient world was, if it can become a clear concept, if it can be given a historical life, then there is the possibility it can gain substance itself under its own momentum and become an entity. The process was called entification. I mean, it's very big in AI at the minute, curiously. So, there are interesting precedents for that. But, these are the marshals, these are the lords of the dark circles, which are in direct service to Satan. I mean, certainly, I think, as far as I recall, Dante mentions 9 circles. Mm-hmm. And, of course, that's meant to be the mirror image of the 9 circles in heaven. Right. You get a very interesting image at the core of that book. People forget it's a divine comedy. I mean, everything works out okay in the end. If something was a tragedy in the ancient world, if it didn't work out, if it was a comedy, it worked out. I think Dante is escorted by the angels into heaven at the end, so everything is cool. But, as Satan was thrown out of heaven, the idea is there's a crater at the top of the world where that body hit the earth, which has pushed the soil out on the other side, pushed the rock and soil out into being a mountain. And it's through the circle, it's through sort of the entrance, it's through this indenture in the earth as you walk down it into the inner earth, you find the 9 circles, each one of which is ruled by a prince of hell, until you actually see the figure of the inverted Satan himself, who is, of course, upside down because he was thrown out of heaven and fell head first, who has 3 heads because he's trying to mimic the Trinity and can't do it.
I just find it very interesting that there's the 7, and if I'm not mistaken, in the Book of Enoch, which wasn't discovered until later, and I'm sure it was known, but I don't know if it was known by Milton and Dante, but they were the 7 lieutenants. Then they had angel names. I think Azazel. I think Belial was one. Are they parallels? Are they the same, or is it just it's a coincidence that it's a number 7? Or 7 comes up a lot.
Don't forget, 7 is a sacred number in the ancient world. I mean, they practice gematria. I mean, for every letter in the Hebrew alphabet, there's a symbol, there's a star, there's a gemstone, there's a plant, there's an association. I mean, what they were doing back in those days was building what we would consider an entire philosophical language with endless associations built into it. So it wasn't just a group of ideas, it was a group of associations which was meant to build in the mind this map, this sort of experience of what we were going through as human beings. So the inversion of the sacred 7 is what is going on there. For every angelic power, for all of the 7 angelic powers, there were 7 demonic powers. Because the darkness, the blackness of the night was trying to oppose the force of light on every level.
So whoever wrote the books of Enoch, whether it was Enoch or someone else, they were using that quite purposefully, and then Dante and Milton borrowed it or came upon that same conclusion themselves.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very ancient idea. I don't think that those concepts are absent from either of those authors.
Okay, let's get ourselves back a little bit to the subject of the conference. I think you did a great job of telling us who the Nephilim are generally thought to be. There are 2 other terms that I hear related to the Nephilim that I'm not exactly sure what they are or if there's agreement. One was introduced to me by our mutual acquaintance, your dear friend, someone that I don't know well enough to call dear friend, but someone that has worked with me, but Jim Williamson, and hopefully he's doing well. The Gaborim.
Yeah, I mean, you're looking at different tribes of monstrosity. They're the cousins of the Nephilim. They're not Nephilim themselves, but they're the cousins. They're still the forbidden offshoots, the forbidden progeny of this liaison that should never have taken place. I mean, I think the end of the story for the fallen entities, which is interesting, is that they were cast into the outer darkness. Strange story, that one. So you get Hades, which isn't simply a graveyard. I mean, if you look at some modern scholars, they want to make it equivalent with a modern graveyard. In other words, where there's no life, where there are bones, where there are ruins. And, we all end up in Hades. That's not quite what the ancients meant. I mean, they would have envisaged a realm of leftovers, some of which were psychic. I mean, human beings would have become psychic husks. The leftover of the body. What happens to the psychic component? It's left over, but barely conscious, in a dreamlike state, because it has none of the energies that the body can give it anymore. So it's just floating around as a leftover. But there are elements, there are worlds beneath that. And Tartarus was one of them. It was, as far below Hades as the earth is below paradise. So the entities that cause this problem in the first place are put basically into a cell. They're put into a holding area. They can't do any more. They can't make any more trouble until judgment can be enacted upon them. But what they've done is they fathered and mothered not simply the Nephilim, but cousin ethnicities, cousin groups that were also prowling around looking for trouble and oppressing good people.
So who else other than the Gaborim is the Raphaim one of these other cousins?
Yeah.
Are there others?
Again, I wouldn't claim I'm a huge authority. I've heard of about 3 others, but I don't know enough of this particular area to say that they're directly Nephilim related, Joe.
Well, what are the words, the names?
There was one one, God Darathim, and I'd have to look at my own notebooks, which aren't in front of me at the moment, to see the other two.
Okay, interesting. Do you think that the different cousins, so to speak, are because they were fallen angels from the different choirs, or is that not it at all?
I mean, it's always possible. I mean, don't forget, the Watchers wouldn't be angels. They were these weird entities, whatever they were. Certainly you get in 1 Timothy, I think, where he says, if God didn't spare those angels in their first estate, so certainly Timothy thinks we're referring to angels. But that's not, as I say, necessarily the meaning of the rabbinical originals. I don't think you're looking at angelic activity with these ethnicities at all. You're looking at something else interacting with the human race in a way that it shouldn't have been doing. And a number of groups being born from that. So you're not looking at angelic necessarily interference. You are looking at very superior beings coming around and coming down and throwing their superiority around.
And then the jinn is something completely different, though.
Well, I mean, not necessarily. Certainly Sufi and Arabic theology is something I know very little about. I know it's enticingly beautiful and complex because, of course, they come along at a different point in history. And they've got all of the artillery of the schoolmen, of the medievals. They know how to categorize things. They've got books we no longer had in the West on Aristotle and the ancient Greek philosophers. So they actually start from that point of origin. They don't start. I mean, if you listen to some people nowadays, you think they're just a group of Arabs, riding around on camels, beating each other senseless. Actually, Islam started in quite a developed way because that part of the world valued scholarship, and they had books that we destroyed. I mean, there were various purges in the church, destroying philosophical and scientific texts. And Aristotle, again, what is wrong with human beings? They just lost his books. So, they only survived by accident in that part of the world. And therefore, Islam came along and thought, well, that's highly significant. We're using it to found what we're doing, to build what we're doing. Certainly, some of the scholars are relating these beings to what we would call either the Watchers or the Nephilim. Apparently the jinn are made of fire. They're not made of soul like us. They're made of fire. And the spiteful, the evil jinn, some of whom have horns on their heads, they're not. I mean, nothing can oppose Allah. Nothing. That's not possible in their system. It's actually not possible in ours if you read the text properly. But if you listen to some modern preachers, you'd be surprised at that. Nothing actually can ever challenge or stand against Allah. It's not possible. But these things are allowed leeway through what we would call secular mundane history. They're allowed to do, it's like giving somebody enough rope to hang themselves. Right? You lot do what you do, and then we'll see what's inside you. We'll see what worth you've got. We'll see what you're like as a person. So Allah and the angels are allowing that to see if the good jinn are good and the bad jinn are bad, and what influence and impact they'll have on the human race. So I would put my neck out there and say, yes, there is a link. But I can't think of anybody that's actually written upon that yet.
Well, it's not going to be me, but it seems like something that somebody should write about. All right, so we're not sure about the jinn. We have the Nephilim, who are the offspring of the Watchers, so they're not angels. It's not like they were fallen angels. They're something else entirely.
Well, some people say they're angels, but at the risk of being contentious, I think they haven't followed the text carefully enough. No, I mean, if the text wanted to say angel, it would have said angel. It wouldn't have said Watcher.
Okay. All right. And then we also have the Goborim and the Raphaim. So it's not about certain were pre-flood, certain were post-flood, as some would have you believe. It's that they're just different variations of this Congress.
Well, I mean, a friend of mine, believe it or not, is Ali Marzulli. He would certainly talk about pre-flood and post-flood. And yeah, I count Jim as a very, very good friend of mine. He's having a few health difficulties at the minute. So anyone that's listening to this show who believes in prayer, please send out some prayers for Jim. He's having a tough time, and he's a good man, and he doesn't deserve it. So anyone that believes in prayer, please send out some positive energies to Jim. Yeah, I mean, even my trouble with that is even if they're post-flood variants, they're still variants of the Nephilim.
Right. Right. They wouldn't need a new name just because of the flood. So
yeah,
that's fair enough. Okay. So, all right. So that did a pretty good job. And I think that, I don't know what else sells the conference other than the complexities here and the fact that folks have an opportunity to hear from yourself and, I don't know, about a dozen people of different expertise and from different disciplines and different philosophies and different interpretations of scripture and philosophies and theosophies on this very subject. And then you can decide for yourself, or you can be like me and 30 months later still not be sure and hoping that there's an easy answer. But nothing hard has an easy answer usually. Dr. Reverend David Parry, thank you very much, and remind people again where the conference is, when the conference is, how they can buy tickets, and how else they can find you and support you, because you have a veritable plethora of projects.
Oh, let me say, it's been a real honour getting to know you, Jim.
Oh, thank you.
Jeff, sorry. Remember, it's past midnight here, so I'm fading fast in a minute. You've been the true gatekeeper of this project. I was very suspicious of you at first.
I know.
And Garden of Doom, which of course is GOD, so that had me very, very suspicious. You've turned into a good friend of mine. You're the real stalwart helping me with this project. Your help has been inestimable, and your friendship is something I treasure. I mean, I haven't known you as long as Jim, but you're becoming that sort of person to me, and I'm very, very grateful that you're in my life and that you're with us in this project. Let me say one thing about the panel. My view is that we're looking at human origins. It started in 2013. As people probably won't know, one of the other hats I wear is as a British theatrical. I directed and produced 9 major productions. It's not my career because I like choosing what I want to do, and what I want to do is metaphysical material. So I'm not a tart like Spielberg and those people. I choose what I want to do. But those are major productions, and sometimes between the productions you think, well, for publicity purposes, we've got to keep up, and face out there. You've got to be seen. So this idea started back then, as I say, 2013, because of a friend of mine, Vladimir Wiedemann, who is on the panel.
Yep.
And he'd been involved with Moscow State University, where they beat all of us, Europeans, Americans, by talking about the diversity of the human condition way before anyone over here was talking about it. There were giant people, there were big people, there were small people. Basically we weren't looking at the real hard science and history of it all. None of that came across because of the Cold War and the Iron Curtain. And it was Vladimir that actually said to me, look, have you thought of doing something on all this? To which, of course, I said, well, no, that's the anthropology side of it all. Are all these mythologized stories, and there's nothing trivial in mythology and mythologizing. These are deep-seated truths of the human race and what it means to be human, at the very least. So I said, no, I'm not really involved in all of that. It sounds fascinating. To which he replied, none of this has ever been touched. Now, that's not entirely true. With the fall of the Iron Curtain, those resources did start to trickle over here. And some universities, particularly Stanford, I think, in the States, have started talking about similar ideas. But I thought it was still worth putting on. But it collapsed. I'm not a person that necessarily believes in too many subtle forces. I won't say none, but I'm not necessarily given to that type of thinking easily. It was Jim Wilhelmsen that said to me, oh, the Nephilim, they don't like being discussed. Shut up, Jim. It's evangelical garbage, which I wouldn't have said to him, of course. Yes, Jim. Yes. Ironically, 2 weeks later, the entire project had collapsed. Or maybe not ironically. I'll never trust a British bank again as long as I live. All of a sudden, our modest credit line had been removed, apparently to save our business. You're kidding?
Yeah.
We were on the stage. We were at the stage of booking flights and accommodation, and then all of a sudden couldn't pay for any others. The whole thing collapsed, and we had to apologise to everybody. They decided, in their wisdom, to restate the modest credit line after the conference. So of course, there was no point in doing it. And I ended up thinking, okay, that's a good idea, but we'll leave it there. But it was recently that my partner said that was a good idea, because you're not only looking at comparative religion, you're looking at comparative mythologies, comparative text, and indeed history and archaeology. And so why not revive it? And I thought, well, that means you get an interdisciplinary panel looking at core questions. So that's what interested me. And of course, we get people on the panel, which I see as a rolling panel, a rollover panel. Each year there'll be a slightly different collection of people speaking, but I see it as at least a 5-year-long project of experts in different fields trying to compare notes with their audiences of what all this means. What is the truth behind it all? So certainly that's my view of what's happening. I suspect next year we'll be meeting in Scotland, but there's another tale behind that one. And so what we're doing is we're looking at human origins, we're looking at religious truths, we're looking at philosophical possibilities, occult testimonies. There are occultists involved, there are atheists involved, who think the whole thing is simply what we would call race memory, or it's, the legendary attribution of early races in the human imagination, and some of them are very small and some of them are very big. But you've got to remember that the children of Israel, when they're going into the lands of Canaan, I mean, if we look at it through the lens of modern DNA, I mean, they weren't exactly big people. They were all about sort of 5 foot something, whereas the Canaanites were about, they were 6 footers. Yeah, these were not small people, they were big people. So you could read the statement, we were grasshoppers in their sight, as a poetic way of saying these are big bastards.
Right.
We've got to be careful of them. Let's get it all on the table. Let's have a look at what all these things mean and where we're going with it. So this is a 5-year-long project, and all. It started last year with a virtual meeting last April. We actually had a hybrid meeting, by which I mean virtual and in-person get-together at the Royal Asiatic Society last October. If I didn't know better, I would swear there's a force against us. There's been a force against us from that time onwards. We were booking with David Kane College for this year because I thought we needed at least 200 seats. And everything has gone wrong since then. Why are we not at David Kane College? I let the ground go fallow for months for the simple business reason I knew they wanted payment. So I didn't bother to follow up the booking for months. I recently contacted them to find not only couldn't they find my booking, which is very strange because they were quoting my own emails at me. That may not be the whole truth. But they'd actually put the venue hire up by £1,000 for no reason whatsoever. And I remember writing them a snotty email the next day saying, this is completely unprofessional, and it's really interesting to see you care nothing for your professional reputation in London. So we, out of a point of principle, let alone money, I couldn't have afforded it. We abandoned David Kane College. We're now at the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. Yes, the CIA, but that's purely a coincidence. in Bloomsbury Square, 5 minutes from the British Museum, lovely and central, a gorgeous old Georgian building, free tea and coffee all day when you can meet the panellists for this year. I mean, the difference between 200 seats and our now 80 seats means that the revenues have changed. The booking has also had to change slightly. So I can't afford to fly over all of the people that I wanted to. And Jim is very poorly at the minute, so I'm worried about him. But, it's a reduced panel this year. But what does that mean in terms of 2023? An expanded panel over a weekend. I'll just find the details of booking for you now. Right, hang on, I've got them here.
Okay. No problem.
So we're Nakanuk, NACONUK, Nakanuk22.eventbrite.co.uk. and our online tickets and our virtual tickets are available through that address.
Wonderful. All right, folks. Well, I know that a lot of the listeners are in the U.S. Probably the second place is UK, so you all are definitely in play. For those folks in Canada or Australia, I'm sure you're welcome to there as well. But and for the many other countries around the world where I have listeners, you're probably more interested in the virtual tickets. It's a bargain. You get 2 days worth of content, live stream. So, treat yourself and hear from lots of different people with lots of different views. And the reduced panel, I think, is still 10 or 12 people, all said and told, excluding myself, who, for whatever reason, is going to have something to say and better come up with something smart pretty soon. But anyway, you'll hear from actual experts and thinkers in their particular disciplines. I think it's a very brave thing you're doing by not making it sort of mono thinking, not even close. You invite quite the opposite. So, I thank you for all the kind words you gave me, but I'm really humbled by them because I don't really feel like I've done all that much other than have fun, and that's great because that's mostly what the show was about, even though it's called Garden of Doom, and the acronym was definitely an accident. So I realized it afterwards, and I'm like, oops. And most longtime listeners of the show know how the name came about. It really has nothing to do with any of it. It just has to do with my original podcast partner was at the time manically gardening, and we were just trying to come up with things that we're doing, and he was gardening all over the place, and I'm sort of grumpy, so Garden of Doom it was. That's all the deep thought that went into it. But maybe not, who knows. Anyway, I thank you again for coming on the show. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and knowledge with us. Thank you for the historical and theological context from it. And you covered many different disciplines, and not all that are in your immediate, what one might think of when they hear of Reverend. So thank you for that. I will be talking to you soon. And for the rest of you folks out there, get your tickets. And make sure to like and subscribe and share the Garden of Doom, and you'll hear from us again next week, or perhaps if it's still Spooktober, middle of the week also, because we'll be doing our 2 shows a month during Spooktober. So thanks again for listening into the Garden of Doom.